On Primetime Politics, a new Prime Minister.
I, Mark Carney, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty, King Charles III, King of Canada, his heirs and successors.
Mark Carney is officially sworn in as Canada's 24th Prime Minister. He names a smaller cabinet to take on Donald Trump and to give Canadians a taste of how he'll govern ahead of an expected election. Coming up, our political strategists will give their assessments of Mr. Carney's choices, and the bureau chiefs will give us their take on the changing of the guard in Ottawa. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Canada's newest Prime Minister was quick to take action today, holding a cabinet meeting this afternoon, then announcing the death of the carbon tax.
We will be eliminating the Canada fuel charge, the consumer fuel charge, immediately, and we will be ensuring that those Canadians who have received rebates will continue to receive a rebate in the next quarter. The next payment is before the end of April. This will make a difference to hard-pressed Canadians, but it is part of a much bigger set of measures that this government is taking to ensure that we fight against climate change, that our companies are competitive, and the country moves forward. So it's my honor, on behalf of my colleagues, to sign this order.
Of course, that was Mark Carney, who just hours before that announcement was sworn in as Canada's 24th Prime Minister, replacing Justin Trudeau after last weekend's leadership win and announcing a cabinet more streamlined than the last, 23 ministers instead of 37, and while close to gender parity, falling slightly short with 11 women and 12 men, 13 when you count the Prime Minister. Take a listen now to the opposition leaders and their take on Carney's picks.
He's signifying clearly that he is not interested or not prioritizing labor, unions, workers. That is very problematic to me. He's also showing us his plan. His plan is to ignore the plight of working people and to have a tax cut for millionaires, to cut services and cut workers. That is not the right plan for Canadians. Also, notably, Karina Gould is not in cabinet, and that's sending a message to progressive Liberals that there's no place for you in this new Liberal Party with Mark Carney at the head.
Today, Liberals are trying to trick Canadians into electing them for a fourth term in power with a cabinet that is 87% the same as Trudeau's cabinet. 100% of today's Liberal cabinet were in Justin Trudeau's Liberal caucus. These same Liberal MPs voted to hike the carbon tax, double the debt, double food bank lineups, and double housing costs.
Well, let's dig into this now. Susan Smith is a former Liberal strategist, co-founder and principal at Blue Sky Strategy Group. Cole Hogan is a conservative digital strategist, principal at GT. George Soule, former director of communications for the federal NDP. Thank you three for coming in again.
Thanks for having us, Michael. Exciting week.
Yeah, I know. It's been a crazy week. Listen, I want to start here with what we heard from Pierre Poilievre regarding this cabinet choice, because he makes the argument, really, at the end of the day, this is a reshuffling of the chairs. These are still members of the Trudeau government, members of the Trudeau cabinet. Is that a problem for Mark Carney, Susan, if what he's trying to do is show a meaningful change from the last Prime Minister?
I think he's successfully shown a meaningful change. He is the new Prime Minister. He's also trying to show some competence and the right kind of continuity in terms of the relationships that have been built with the Trump administration. These are critical. Dominic LeBlanc, François-Philippe Champagne, David McGuinty, Melanie Joly, Bill Blair at Defense. There's been a few changes of the chairs with Champagne and LeBlanc, but that's really important. But at the same time, he's brought in some new people and he's moved some people around. For example, taking Stephen Guilbeault out of Environment and Climate Change Canada. That's a very strong signal, I think, to people, particularly in Western Canada, about the kind of economic focus that Mr. Carney wants to have. He's put together a wartime cabinet. We're down to 23 members, including 24, including him. He's Prime Minister 24 cabinet ministers. And he's focused on the economy and security. And he even said in his first news conference that likely out of cabinet today, the carbon tax will be canceled. So that's the kind of signal he wants to send.
And we did hear that today, exactly. So Cole, what do you make of it? Because, you know, I hear what you're saying, Susan, but at the end of the day, Canadians know these names because they were part of the last government.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the points here. Like a lot of what the Conservatives are saying today is 87% of Carney's cabinet was in Trudeau's cabinet. So I think it's kind of difficult for Mark Carney to get up there and say this is a brand new government. It looks like Justin Trudeau's government and Liberal Party just asking for a fourth term in government that they sorely don't deserve. These are the same people that hiked the carbon tax, that doubled the debt, housing costs, the cost of living, and Canadians know that. So this isn't change, and the Liberals can't pretend otherwise.
George?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that he tried very hard to make to just make change and say that he was changing. But I agree with some of what Cole was saying. Like it is the same people largely. I was surprised, and again, trying to make this big message of change, and then have Jerry Butts show up for the photo op today. One of the key architects of the Justin Trudeau era. You know, it's been kind of an open secret in Ottawa that he was helping run the Carney campaign, but for him to now choose today to kind of pop his head up, I thought was a strange tactic. So I understand the goal of trying to make the change, and I think in some ways they might get away with it with Canadians, but there's just a few key things. You know, at Mr. Guilbeault as well. I mean, moving him from out of environment, sure, that's a huge signal for the West, but keeping him in cabinet gives a hammer to the Conservatives to hit the Liberals with. So I don't quite understand it.
So we have to go back to cabinet making from a civics lesson perspective. You have to draw from the caucus. The Prime Minister, Prime Minister Carney, is drawn from his caucus, just like if Pierre Poilievre gets elected, he'll draw from his caucus. I think he said, this is the cabinet for now, for the moment. We're going to go into an election. I think you'll see some new faces come forward, and I guarantee you that should Mr. Carney win the election, then we will have a newly composed cabinet. But look at the people that are there. Cody Blois, a young lawyer from Nova Scotia, long an advocate in the agriculture file, he's in. That's a new face. Ariel Kayabaga from London, Ontario, originally from Burundi, she's a new face. Ali Assassi, he's a trade lawyer by training, he's a new face. The other faces that you have at the cabinet table, not respectfully, aren't all household names, but super bright folks. Rachel Bendayan's a trade lawyer, bilingual from Montreal. She's in immigration. You've really got some very strong people in there, but the Prime Minister of the day, by the nature of the way this country goes, has to draw from his or her caucus to make up the cabinet, and I think we have a really solid bunch of people.
Okay, draw from caucus, but I'm also wondering about policy, and Cole, I'm going to bring you in here because, you know, we heard Prime Minister Carney essentially follow through what he said he was going to do. He's going to stop the consumer carbon tax. He also talks about putting more money in Canadians' wallets by spending less. He also talks about protecting jobs. You know, has he kneecapped the Conservative party by essentially taking the platform in some ways that they've been campaigning on for the last couple of years?
Well, we've seen Pierre Poilievre and the rest of the Conservatives team say if you want conservative policies, you're going to have to vote for the Conservative Party. And, you know, we've seen Mark Carney parrot a lot of, you know, conservative policies in order to try to shift gears from the more leftward turn of the Trudeau Liberals. But I think what's interesting in particular, too, looking at Guilbeault, is I think that he was moved from environment because Carney might have, you know, a more, let's call it, radical environmental plan. I see there's been some interesting policies from Guilbeault. I'll give you a perfect example here. In his previous role, Mark Carney advocated for the financial sector divesting from all investments in the oil and gas sector. So we saw the Trudeau Liberals had their plan to get to net zero by 2035. They then capitulated and went to net zero by 2050. Mark Carney in his previous work advocated for global net zero by 2030. So if his plan for that was to get the financial sector to not invest in oil and gas projects, I want to know, as Prime Minister, does he still think that we should not be investing in oil and gas projects in Canada when we so sorely need them in this tariff war?
Although they're talking more about Energy East right now, and the Liberals are talking about as openly as anybody else.
Yeah, Mark Carney's been clear on the leadership campaign trail in his speech on Sunday that we all heard in Ottawa, saying he wants Canada to be an energy superpower in conventional and renewable energy. So I think that's very clear. Look, Carney is what used to be called a blue liberal. I am one of those. He's about fiscal responsibility. He's also about government playing a role where and when it's necessary, but not where and when it isn't necessary. It's about getting the economy back on the rails. It's about dealing with Trump. And this is what Pierre Poilievre is worried about. The ballot question for Canadians is going to be, who do you think is best to be able to deal with Donald Trump? Mr. Carney is an economist. He's worked in the real world, made real life decisions and policies, and and implicated them and costed budgets. Pierre Poilievre has been a politician for his whole life. He's upset. They're on their back heels at the moment, so they're going to try and throw whatever they can at Carney. But I think Carney sent a signal right away. His first message was, we're going to work to preserve the jobs of workers and rebuild the Canadian economy. We're going to build 1 million homes, and we're going to make Canada, it's about Canada strong.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a second. I'm going to bring you in, George, because I also want to talk about Jagmeet Singh here. We heard from Mr. Singh a couple times today. The first one actually had to do with a post that he put up for Prime Minister Trudeau as things were getting underway in Rideau Hall, because in this tweet, you see it right there, he essentially thanks and congratulates Prime Minister Trudeau for his time in office. He wishes him well. He wishes him more time with his kids, which, you know, in terms of how partisan and toxic politics is these days, that was a nice moment from Mr. Singh. But then he goes on to criticize Mr. Carney's choices later in the day, because he makes the argument that Mark Carney, in the choices that he has made, abandons progressives, symbolized greatly by the fact that Karina Gould, arguably the most progressive of the candidates in the leadership run for the Liberals, was essentially shut out of the cabinet today. George, what do you make of that?
Well, I think, you know, Mark Miller as well, who, you know, frankly did a decent job working with First Nations across this country, and then was doing some good work with immigration as well. He was also left out, maybe because he was too close to Justin Trudeau. But again, when you have Jerry Butts and other people who are close back in, it's hard to understand. Also, Mr. Carney doesn't have a Minister of Labour. It's the first time in decades upon decades.
He's a Minister of Jobs, though.
Yes.
Sure, I mean, it's great to change the name, but the word labor, as far as organized labor, working with the people who represent workers across this country, has been, Stephen Harper had one even. So like that move away is significant. There's no minister responsible for women and gender equity, which again is a step away, especially from what we've seen over the last decade with Justin Trudeau. And I would say, I know Cole's saying that, oh, he's too environmental, but again, moving away from the carbon tax, Cody Bloy from out east, he was kind of benched from the Trudeau government because he supported the Conservative bill to take the carbon tax off of drying wheat and heating barns, which I actually happen to support that bill as well, personally, but for those people from the New Democrats and others on the left who believe more in strong environmental positions at all costs, that's a big step away from Mr. Carney too. So I think he is moving away from those positions, and I think it's something that should be called out, because it's not who the Liberals are anymore. And even Susan says, and that's fine. It's fine that shift's happened, but we need to mark it and be clear that if progressives really want a progressive government, Mark Carney might not be their answer anymore.
Oh, okay, Cole, what do you make of that in terms of, does that create an opening or a vulnerability for Mark Carney that he's being questioned on his progressive credentials?
Sure, and I look in particular too, just as someone from Western Canada, I look at the fact that there's only 2 people in this cabinet west of Ontario. Mark Carney got that question in the presser today, and they asked him, where's the Western Canadian representation? And then he pointed to Chrystia Freeland and said, well, Chrystia is from Western Canada, I'm from Alberta as well. And it's like, well, okay, yes, both of you do have roots in Alberta, but I think both in politics and in policy, no one thinks they're true representation of Western Canada or Alberta.
Okay, you're dying to get in. Go for Susan.
With respect to my friend Cole, who you often say you're from Saskatchewan, maybe you still have a Saskatchewan driver's license, but my guess is pretty high that you have an Ontario one. And so you never take the soul out of people from where they actually come from. So we have Minister Dogood from Manitoba. You have Jonathan Wilkinson from BC. Yes, that part is true. Carney is from Alberta, so is Chrystia Freeland, and arguably Carney was born in the north. This is the cabinet before the election. What I'm hearing from my friends is Mark Carney's too progressive, Mark Carney's not progressive enough. That's like a little bit too hot, a little bit too cold, maybe just right is where he's going to land for Canadians.
But is it a vulnerability though? Because
I don't think so.
in terms of a polarized politics, progressives may be looking for a place to go and may not be the Liberals under that type of criticism.
And where they're going to go to Pierre Poilievre. This is a 2-horse race when it comes to the ballot question on Trump. This is not a race. This is a race where Jagmeet Singh is trying to get into the mix. He's a nice man and took the classy high road on the tweet to Justin Trudeau. That was very nice. He is a nice man, but he's not the guy that Canadians are considering in terms of putting them up against Trump. Trump's going, and Poilievre's messaging aligns with Trump. 10% of his base is heavily Trumpers and would like to be the 51st state, and 9 out of 10 Canadians are fighting for Canada. Elbows out.
Time. You got 30 seconds to respond to that.
Well, just say that kind of, I mean, with respect to Susan, like that kind of arrogance is the old style liberal arrogance of like, don't listen to the other parties, nobody else matters, it's just us and the Conservatives. And that red door, blue door, people have rejected in the past when it's been put to them that starkly, and I think that that's a shot for Jagmeet to get back in the debate.
Okay, George, Susan Cole, we all like each other. Remember that. Thank you for this. We'll chat again.
Thank you.
Well, let's shift our conversation back to earlier this morning, because while Mr. Carney outlined his priorities, he was also asked about Donald Trump, and take a listen to what we heard from the new Prime Minister.
We respect the United States. We respect President Trump. President Trump has put some very important issues at the top of his agenda. We understand his agenda. We understand the importance of addressing the scourge of fentanyl, which is a challenge here in Canada as well as the United States. But in many respects, part of my experience overlaps with that of the President. We'll both be looking out for our countries, but he knows, and I know from long experience, that we can find mutual solutions that win for both.
Well, let's bring in the Ottawa Bureau Chiefs now to talk about this. Robert Fife, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Joël-Denis Bellavance, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for LaPresse. Hello, hello, hello.
Hey there.
Hi, Michael.
So listen, I want to start with almost a broad stroke here, because we heard now Prime Minister Carney say that this was a smaller cabinet, an action-oriented cabinet. It would deliver protection for jobs, more money for Canadians' pockets by spending less than, of course, addressing the carbon tax. Has he basically just pulled the platform out of a Conservative platform out from Pierre Poilievre?
Well, he has in a lot of areas. You know, he says he wants to build more pipelines. He says he wants to tear down provincial trade barriers, get rid of the consumer levy, get rid of the capital gains tax, increase defense spending, have a greater role in the Arctic. All of these things were policies, very similar policies that Pierre Poilievre had run on. But I think the other issue that's been effective for them is to try to show to the Canadian public that they are responsible in dealing with President Trump. I thought it was remarkable today how he went out of his way to say, I respect the president. We have a lot in common. I'm a business person. I was involved in real estate. I met him at the G20 when I was the Bank of England governor. I think, you know, I understand why he's concerned about American jobs and fentanyl. I am too. Let's figure out if we can have an avenue. That is something that Justin Trudeau wasn't able to do. He just didn't have a good relationship with him. And I think those policies of moving the Liberal Party to the center, but also trying to show, it'll probably be impossible with Trump, but trying to show the country that he's trying to deal with this with the President Trump in a new way, is probably going to help him with Canadians.
Help with Canadians.
At the same time, though, and all of that is so in terms of the way he addressed Trump today, but I also was struck by the message that he's still going to demand and expect respect on behalf of the U.S. vis-a-vis Canada, its economic interests, and its sovereignty, in saying we're a client, we're your largest client. So he's making a business case argument. That jumped out at me as well. And yeah, I mean, to what extent will he undercut the Conservatives' political campaign in an election? It's going to be tough after he eliminates the consumer carbon tax to keep calling him Carbon Tax Carney. But I'm also interested in, and I think, Joel, didn't you find it interesting, like, will he be able to maintain the Liberals' kind of surge in Quebec right now? Because already we've heard some of the leaders come out and say, you know, we're progressive on the environment, and Canadian culture is not Quebec culture. And not having a title, official languages, says something, right? So I thought there's a lot of interesting domestic signals there too.
Yeah, Joel?
Well, in Quebec right now, like in the rest of Canada, we've tuned into the threat that Mr. Trump is representing. And so the ballot box question has changed already. And in terms of Mr. Carney's French, I think Quebecers are ready to give him a pass because his French is not as efficient or as fluent as Pierre Poilievre, but they're looking for a reassuring figure at the helm of the federal government. And that's what Mr. Carney is trying to project. I've been dealing with crisis, the economic crisis in 2008, the Brexit crisis in Great Britain. I know what it takes to lead a government or a machinery in those crises, in those times. And trust me, I know how I can deal with Mr. Trump. So those words, I think, are destined to reassure Quebecers, but also Canadians overall, that he will be bringing some stability, some calmness to the table, and that's what we need right now.
Okay. I'm smiling because if the ballot box question has changed to Trump, so is the discussion. I began with platform, but let's go to Donald Trump.
Every dinner table everywhere in Canada, right?
It shifts right over. But when we talk about Donald Trump, though, what's also interesting is the announcement today, or at least the sharing the news, that Mark Carney's first trip is not going to be to the United States. He was asked about that. Instead, it's going to be to Europe. What do you make of that move?
Oh, I think that's a really smart move, because the message he sends to Canadians, because he's been saying we can't rely on the United States anymore. We have to diversify our trade. We're not even sure we can rely on the United States on security issues. So he's going to big players in Europe. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, and the UK Prime Minister, who he actually has personally advised. And that's going to be a powerful message. The visuals and the commentary will send a message back to Canada that this guy is respected on the global, and reaching into Quebec with Macron, and reaching into the rest of the country with Keir Starmer, I think is a smart move on his behalf. It's too bad he wasn't able to go to meet the German leader too, and then he would have had a trio, right?
But I mean,
European trifecta.
Yeah, and it's walking the talk. He's been saying throughout his campaign to get to this office today that he wants to diversify trade and strengthen our partnerships and make Canada less reliant on the U.S. What better way to actually show that and demonstrate it than to do this trip?
Mm-hmm. What do you make the move? Because there were questions being asked. If we're in this trade war with the United States, why isn't the first outreach to Washington rather than to Europe?
Because it would be useless to go see Mr. Trump right now before an election, because Mr. Trump would use it as a puppet and make fun of him and embarrass him. We've seen other leaders gone to the Oval Office and they were embarrassed by Mr. Trump and his rant about anything but nothing. So I think that's wise to stay away from him. Just because he wants to affirm his Canadian sovereignty. A way to do it is to say, we want to be friends with you, but we've got other friends also on the planet. We don't rely only on you, and that's the message I think he wants to send. And also, he's been using the word constantly during the leadership race, and again today at this press conference, Maître chez nous. Yep. That is a very powerful symbol in Quebec.
Yeah. And to that point, there are very few leaders who go to visit Donald Trump in the Oval Office and come out with their dignity intact. One way or another, you're either forced to cajole him and flatter him and maybe hope to slide your perspective in front of the cameras. It's a no-win situation right now for Mark Carney.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and his strategy here is obviously he wants to have a good relationship as best he can with the president. And his words today were certainly signaling that. But, all the people around him say he wants to have these talks in private, because there is no win for anybody with Trump in front of a camera.
Yeah, fair enough. Listen, before we're done, we should also talk about the cabinet choices, though. And we're expecting a writ to be dropped within a week's time, so how long it stays as a cabinet is another issue. But when you look at it on the surface, you have François-Philippe Champagne going to finance, Dominic LeBlanc, international trade, Chrystia Freeland now transport, Anita Anand, industry. No place was made for Karina Gould, Mark Miller, nor for Mark Holland. I think each one of those choices has an interesting story. Which one stands out for you, Bob?
Well, I think what stood out for me is Champagne to finance. The business community in this country had been very disillusioned with the Trudeau government, including Chrystia Freeland as finance minister, imposing bank taxes, imposing a capital gains tax, which is a tax on entrepreneurs who risk their money. The spending and spending and spending, and every solution to a problem involves spending. Champagne is a blue liberal. He's a Chrétien liberal. And that is a message, and he's well liked on Bay Street. Bank presidents all love this guy because he understands the economy. He understands business. He's a former businessman himself. And it's sending a very significant message to the business community that the old Liberals are back. And the problem the Conservatives have is, who's their finance minister? Like
Great point.
Pierre Poilievre.
Pierre Poilievre spent a lifetime in, as Mr. Carney says, this is a guy who's never worked in business. He spent all his life in Parliament.
Yeah, which you managed to find a space to say that today as well.
Yeah.
So what stands out for you?
I mean, there's so many things that actually stood out. All of that around Champagne, I agree with. Miller's being ousted from cabinet at a time when immigration matters to the U.S. I found interesting. The heavy Ontario representation and influence I found very interesting. And look, the ditching gender balance in a cabinet is only perhaps symbolic on some levels, but it will say something to a lot of people about where his priorities are. And it was part of the branding, not just of the cabinet under Trudeau, the budgeting process, the foreign policy, the interest in promoting gender and women was a real thing under the previous, more progressive, perhaps, Liberal Party than we've seen under Mr. Carney. Mr. Carney is putting forward today a different face, a different, at least, focus and perspective. Some of it, though, I think is political marketing as much as actual change. We'll see.
Joël-Denis?
Like Bob, the finance minister's choice was a big one. Blue Liberals trying to recapture those clientele that they've left and maybe park their vote with the Conservative Party. Another one that stood out to me was Stephen Guilbeault. No longer the environment minister, but he's got a new job, Quebec lieutenant of the Prime Minister in Quebec. So he'll have to deal with
and
the
Canadian
Quebec government.
Identity.
Yeah, and the Quebec government, and he's not, getting along very well with the CAQ government of François Legault. They don't like him. He doesn't like them. So I see some frictions on the horizon on that front.
Yeah, and friction because there's going to be a writ drop sooner than later. So we'll see how that all plays out. But I look forward to that conversation. Let's keep focused next time. Just keep focused next time.
More discipline. More discipline.
I'm done. Joël-Denis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that is our program. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back next week. Until then, have a great weekend.